HDR, or high dynamic range, images used to be a term reserved only for high-end photographers, until the newer versions of the iPhone. In order to review images to learn what a high dynamic range image is, I went to my Window menu, Extensions, and brought up Mini Bridge. Now I created a very sophisticated series of images, and I laugh because they're not. I used my latte as a tripod. But I wanted to show several exposures and how you can blend them together using Photoshop's HDR. So if I select Keyboard 1 in my HDR folder and shift-click on Keyboard 4, I can choose from the Mini Bridge View menu, Slideshow, to illustrate what a high dynamic range image truly is. And when this comes up, I'm going to press spacebar immediately to pause. This first shot has an exposure value, I think, of 2.37, and that's something else you'll need to familiarize yourself with. Exposure values, also reported as EV in the metadata. This is the first shot taken, and I used an app on my iPhone to actually adjust the exposure and not use the automatic HDR that the camera app that comes free with your iPhone does. So I got to this end result through an app that I bought. But if I look at this first one, take note of the shadows. I have the original shadow and then 3 lighter shadows that are cast from the lamp nearby my desk. As I hit my right arrow key to review the next image, this third shadow is starting to fade, and the exposure value is still in 2, the number 2, 2.23 maybe. I'll check the numbers. I'll hit my right arrow again, and the third shadow is almost completely gone, and the second and first are starting to fade away. Right arrow one last time, it's really truly gone here, and I can see a trace of it there, but I'm getting one lighter shadow and then our main. So those were 4 images taken with different exposures simply on an iPhone. If I select all 4 of these images using my Shift key, I can merge them into HDR. So I'm going to go to my File menu, Automate, and Merge to HDR High Dynamic Range Pro. And I'll browse to these files in this location. If you do this from the full Bridge application, it will already jump you to the selected images. But I'm using Mini Bridge in Photoshop, so I just pointed to the images I'm looking at in the HDR folder, and I'll hit Open. And if you weren't using a tripod, Photoshop will go that extra step and automatically align the source images. So I will click OK. It's taking all 4 exposures and building one best image, because if you noticed carefully, the Enter key was much more visible and had a lighter shadow when you saw the most light in the image, when the exposure value was the highest, 2.32, so I got my numbers backwards. So here's the lightest shot. It went down to 2.23. This was the normal value. I believe there's no adjustment with the exposure value, or EV at 0, and then -32 created the darkest shot. So if I uncheck the darkest exposure, there's a shift in the image. If I turn it back on, you'll see that data added back in. So Photoshop's goal with Merged HDR Pro is to take the best of the shadows, the best of the highlights, and produce one final image. But sometimes they can look a little posterized or oversaturated. If I uncheck this second exposure, you could see before and after, and I'll experiment by turning exposures on and off to see if I need them. I think turning this second to lightest exposure off produces a far better image, and that gets me a very visible Enter key, but still produces the shadow and detail in all areas. And I could try turning off the lightest exposure, but then I get a darker shadow on the Enter key, so it's only merging these 2 darkest ones. So you really need at least 2. You can't turn off these 2 in order to merge 2 into high dynamic range, a final image based on several different shots. So I'm going to leave this on, and there are more controls that you can play with. Gamma, overall brightness, the exposure setting. You do have to let go after dialing these in to see if you like it. You could add detail, and I'll just make a few small moves. Yeah, gamma a little bit to the left I think works out better. So if I click OK, Photoshop is stitching the 3 exposures I chose into one final image. And there we have it. But let's take a look at a higher end shot where this really proves why you would need it. If I scroll to the left, I've got 8 different exposures of the same scene. And they were actually taken without a tripod. And if I go to slideshow mode, you've got these very dark, ominous clouds with a little bit of blue sky peeking in. And if I don't hit any keys, it just automatically advances. But these little barbed wires are very dark. I can't see the detail of them. I can't see how red they are until you get into the lighter exposures. But as you open up all the foreground portion in the lighter exposures, you completely lose that dark, ominous sky, which I think plays perfectly against this barbed wire fence. So here you could truly see the rusted or red color of the fence. So after it gets through all 8 of the images, the slideshow will exit, and I'm really blowing out all detail here, but it illustrates how Photoshop could blend these together or merge them into one final image. So I don't need to select them again here because I'm going to use File, Automate, Merge into HDR Pro, and I will browse from Fence 1 to Fence 8. I clicked and Shift-clicked, and I'll hit Open, and I'll click OK, and it will align automatically the source images. You may have noticed in full screen, the fence moved a bit. The photographer wasn't using a tripod, and that's okay. It just does the best job with a tripod. It also says you should preserve the high-end camera raw format, or you might lose dynamic range, all the colors and tones that you could store in an image. But we're going to click OK. It's fine. These are PSD. They aren't camera raw images. So once I click OK, Photoshop is overlapping, aligning, and producing one final result with all 8 exposures, hopefully giving me the best of the shadow detail and the best of the highlight detail. But I'm going to turn off the darkest shadow exposure, and there I get a little better sky. As I turn off the second darkest, you could choose which shots you want to keep and which shots you want to lose. When I turn this one off, I really lose my sky. So I'm going to need to keep some of those depending on my goal for the image. I could try turning off some in between to see what it produces. But now, notice where this wasn't aligned with a tripod? No worries. Photoshop has a Remove Ghosts checkbox. And once I do that, it aligned all the shots, removed anything that was a halo, and it produced the best final result out of all 8 exposures. I'm not even going to play with the settings because I think it did perfectly with what I wanted. So I'll click OK, and then I have one high dynamic range shot. HDR is often best in very low light situations where there's so much dark detail that it can get plugged up. So by capturing the different exposures, you get a beautiful shot with a full range of highlights, shadows, foreground, background, everything you see when you're there live in the scene. So if you have a camera that will let you adjust the exposure value, or if you have an app on your iPhone that will let you play with exposure value, try this with the same scene at many different exposures and choose File, Automate, Merge into HDR Pro. There's no specific file format that is HDR itself. HDR, high dynamic range, is a type of an image that's born from several exposures of the same shot. In fact, Apple's HDR, the high dynamic range shot, takes 3 different images in succession at once, and that's how it creates its own high dynamic range or HDR images.